Cops tied up and threw a pregnant woman on the tracks. What happened next shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The hum of the car engine blended seamlessly with the soft notes of the jazz playing through the speakers. The rhythm was soothing, almost hypnotic, as the long stretch of empty road unfolded ahead. Empress trees swayed gently in the cool evening breeze, their dark silhouettes stretching across the pavement. The headlights of the sleek black SUV carved twin beams into the darkness, leading the way back to what should have been the most comforting destination of all, home. Amber Williams adjusted her grip on the steering wheel, her gaze shifting briefly to the dashboard clock. 10:47 p.m. Late, but not unusually so. After all, tonight had been another triumph. Another successful charity event. Another step forward in her lifelong battle against systemic injustice. The foundation she had spent years building was thriving, its reach expanding to places she once only dreamed of. Yet tonight, as she drove alone through the quiet outskirts of town, she allowed herself to relax, to savor the rare stillness. Her right hand instinctively brushed her swollen belly, a subconscious act of reassurance. The baby kicked lightly in response, drawing a soft smile to her lips. Soon, everything would change. Motherhood, a role she had once feared she might never experience, was now just weeks away. For the first time in her life, Amber had permitted herself to believe in the possibility of joy uninterrupted by the shadow of prejudice or struggle. But that belief, however fragile, was always tempered by reality. Even tonight, as she reflected on her accomplishments, there lingered a gnawing awareness of the battles yet to be fought. Amber's very existence was polarizing, her success a provocation to those clinging to outdated systems of power. She had faced death threats, online harassment, and protests outside her offices. Yet nothing had ever stopped her. Not when she was a young girl growing up in a poor neighborhood, not when she was a lawyer fighting to reform corrupt policing practices, and certainly not now. The thought steadied her, and she leaned back into her seat, letting the music carry her thoughts further from the weight of the day. She was just miles from home when she noticed the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. At first, she thought it must be for someone else. The highway was deserted, and her speed had been well below the limit. Her registration and insurance were up to date, and there was no logical reason for her to be stopped. Still, the lights persisted, growing closer, and with a sinking feeling, she realized they were signaling her. Her hands tightened around the steering wheel as she slowed and pulled onto the shoulder. The police cruiser parked behind her, its red and blue lights casting erratic flashes across the empty road and surrounding woods. Amber took a deep breath, steadying herself. Encounters with the police had never been simple for her, even in her position of power. Experience had taught her that neither wealth nor status could fully shield a black woman from suspicion or hostility. She rolled down her window as footsteps approached, rehearsing the script she knew too well: calm, compliant, deferential but not submissive. "Good evening, officers," she said as two men appeared beside her window. Their faces were partially obscured by the glare of the cruiser's lights, but their postures spoke volumes. One leaned casually against her car, arms crossed, while the other shone a flashlight into her vehicle, sweeping it across the seats and the floor. "License and registration," the taller one said, his tone clipped and dismissive. He wore a badge that read "Hail." Amber nodded, keeping her movements deliberate. She reached into her glove compartment for the documents, the flashlight tracking her every motion. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" she said, keeping her voice steady. Hale smirked but didn't answer. His partner, a stockier man with a badge that read Rivers, leaned closer. "Just a routine stop, ma'am. Got a lot of folks coming through this area who don't belong." Amber caught the implication instantly. Her stomach tightened, but she forced herself to maintain her composure. "I see. Well, here are my license and registration. Everything should be in order." Hale glanced at the documents, then handed them back without even looking at her. "Step out of the vehicle," he said abruptly. Her heart skipped. "Excuse me? Is there a problem?" "I said, step out of the vehicle," he repeated, his tone hardening. Rivers' hand rested conspicuously on his holstered gun. Amber hesitated. Every instinct told her this was wrong, that this wasn't just a routine stop, but she also knew what could happen if she refused. Slowly, she unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door, stepping onto the gravel shoulder. The night air was colder than she expected, the chill seeping through her thin coat. The men towered over her, their presence suffocating. Hale circled her car, inspecting it with exaggerated scrutiny, while Rivers stayed close, his hand never leaving his weapon. "Is there something specific you're looking for?" Amber asked, her voice betraying a hint of the anger she fought to suppress. "Drugs, weapons, contraband," Hale said casually, tapping on the hood of her car. "You know, the usual." Her breath hitched. "This is absurd. I'm a law-abiding citizen." "And we're just doing our job," Rivers interrupted, his smirk widening. "You'd do well to cooperate." Amber's hand instinctively went to her belly, a gesture of both protection and defiance. "I'm 7 months pregnant. I don't have time for this." Hale stopped his inspection, leaning against the car with a look of mock concern. "Pregnant, huh? That's sweet. But, see, the law doesn't care if you're carrying a kid. Rules are rules." His words dripped with condescension, and Amber felt her pulse quicken. She could see now that this wasn't about a traffic stop. It was about power. Power they intended to exert over her, no matter the cost. The tension reached a breaking point when Hale grabbed her arm, pulling her roughly toward the cruiser. "We're taking you in for questioning," he said. "For what?" she demanded, her voice rising. "You have no grounds." "That's for us to decide," Rivers sneered. "Now get in the car." Amber's heart pounded as they shoved her into the back seat. Through the window, she could see the empty road stretching into the darkness, her freedom slipping further away with every passing second. The cruiser's engine roared to life, and as they sped away, Amber realized that whatever they had planned for her, it had nothing to do with justice. The ride was long and unnervingly silent, punctuated only by the growl of the engine and the crunch of gravel as the police cruiser sped along a narrow, unmarked road. Amber's pulse thrummed in her ears, her breaths shallow and controlled. She sat in the back seat, wrists bound too tightly behind her with cold metal cuffs. The air inside the car felt suffocating, heavy with unspoken malice. Rivers occasionally glanced back at her through the rearview mirror, his smirk a constant reminder of the power imbalance she was trapped in. Hale drove with one hand on the wheel, the other lazily resting on the armrest, as though this were just another routine drive. Amber stared out of the window, watching the shadows of towering pines whip by under the faint light of the crescent moon. They had long since left the main road, and the absence of streetlights or passing cars deepened her sense of isolation. She wanted to demand answers, to force them to explain this blatant abuse of authority, but she knew better. Every word she uttered could be twisted against her, every protest dismissed as defiance. For now, her priority was survival, for herself, and for the life growing inside her. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. Neither man answered. Hale chuckled under his breath while Rivers shifted in his seat, the leather creaking as he turned to face her briefly. "Don't worry," Rivers said, his tone mockingly sweet. "We're just going for a little ride. Consider it a lesson in humility." Amber's jaw clenched. She could feel the anger rising within her, mingling with fear in a volatile mix. This wasn't just an abuse of power. It was personal. These men knew who she was. Her face had been on the news too many times for them not to. They weren't just targeting her because she was black or because she was a woman. They were targeting her because she was both those things and successful. She represented everything they hated, everything they feared. The cruiser slowed as they approached a clearing. Amber's stomach turned when she saw what lay ahead, a desolate stretch of abandoned railway tracks cutting through a dense thicket of trees. The tracks were rusted, overgrown with weeds, and clearly unused for years. The scene was eerily quiet, save for the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Hale killed the engine and stepped out of the car, slamming the door shut behind him. Rivers followed, yanking open the back door and grabbing Amber by the arm. "Get out," he barked. Amber hesitated, her mind racing through the possibilities. Should she resist? Scream? But the nearest house was miles away, and even if someone heard her, would they help? Rivers pulled her out of the car before she could decide, his grip bruisingly tight. Her feet stumbled on the uneven ground, the sharp stones digging into her soles through the thin leather of her shoes. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded, her voice cracking under the weight of her terror. "You can't." "Oh, we can," Hale interrupted, stepping closer. His face was illuminated by the car's headlights, casting harsh shadows that exaggerated the cruelty in his smirk. "See? People like you think you're untouchable. Think you can run your mouth about reforming the police, tearing down the system, and there won't be any consequences. But out here, there's no one to protect you." Amber's breath hitched as his words sunk in. This wasn't a random act of cruelty. It was premeditated. They had been waiting for an opportunity like this, a moment when she was alone, vulnerable, far from the public eye. Hale gestured towards the tracks, and Rivers dragged her forward, ignoring her protests. The rough terrain made her stumble, and each misstep sent jolts of pain through her swollen abdomen. She clung to the thought of her baby, the tiny heartbeat she had seen on the ultrasound screen just weeks ago. That thought gave her strength, even as the men tied her wrists and ankles with coarse rope and forced her onto the cold, unyielding metal of the rails. The ground beneath her was damp and smelled of rust and decay. The sharp edges of the tracks bit into her back as Rivers tightened the ropes, his face inches from hers. She turned her head away, refusing to meet his gaze, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. "Perfect," Hale said, stepping back to admire their handiwork. "You look real cozy there." Amber glared up at him, her chest heaving with the effort to keep her panic in check. "This is kidnapping, assault. You'll never get away with this." Hale crouched beside her, his face so close she could smell the cheap coffee on his breath. "Who's gonna stop us, huh? Your lawyer husband? The media? Out here, sweetheart, no one's coming to save you. By the time they find you, if they find you, it'll be too late." He stood and turned to Rivers. "Let's go. Train'll be here soon." Amber's heart pounded as she watched them walk back to the car. The headlights dimmed as the cruiser turned around and disappeared down the dirt path, leaving her in darkness. For a moment, all she could hear was the pounding of her pulse and the faint rustle of the trees. Then, in the distance, she heard it. the faint, unmistakable rumble of an approaching train. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe, to think. She wasn't going to die here. She couldn't. Her baby's life depended on her survival, and she wasn't about to let two hateful men decide her fate. The ropes were tight, but not impossible to break. She twisted her wrist, feeling for any give in the knots, any weakness she could exploit. The rumble grew louder, accompanied by the distant wail of a train horn. Panic clawed at her throat, but she forced it down, focusing on the task at hand. She had to get free. She wouldn't let them win. As she struggled, her mind drifted to memories of her childhood. Her father teaching her how to tie and untie knots when they went fishing, her mother's unwavering voice telling her she was stronger than anyone who tried to tear her down. Those lessons had carried her through every challenge in her life, and they would carry her through this. The ground began to vibrate as the train drew nearer, the sound now a deafening roar. Amber's arms burned with exertion, but she refused to stop, refused to give in. The ropes cut into her skin, warm blood trickling down her wrists, but she didn't care. She twisted and pulled with everything she had, her determination fueled by the image of her baby's face, a face she hadn't yet seen, but already loved more than anything. With a final, desperate effort, the rope around her wrist snapped. Her hands flew free, and she immediately worked on the knots around her ankles, her fingers slick with blood but moving with frantic urgency. The train's horn blared, its lights piercing the darkness as it barreled toward her. At the last possible moment, she rolled off the tracks, landing hard on the gravel beside them. The train thundered past, the force of its passage whipping her hair into her face and kicking up clouds of dirt and debris. She lay there for a moment, trembling, her chest heaving as relief and adrenaline coursed through her. She was alive. Barely, but alive. As the train disappeared into the night, Amber forced herself to her feet, every muscle in her body screaming in protest. Her hands were raw and bleeding, her clothes torn and filthy, but she didn't care. She had escaped, and now she would make sure those men paid for what they had done. In the distance, she saw the faint glow of headlights. A car was approaching. Summoning the last reserves of her strength, she stumbled toward the road, hoping, praying, that it was someone who could help. The sound of the train still echoed faintly in Amber's ears as she stumbled toward the road, her legs weak and unsteady beneath her. Every breath was a struggle, her lungs burning from the effort of her escape. The gravel crunched beneath her torn shoes, and the night air, cold and damp, clung to her skin. Each step forward was a battle against the pain coursing through her body. Her hands throbbed, raw and bleeding from where the ropes had bitten into her flesh, and her swollen belly ached with every jolt of movement. Ahead of her, the faint glow of headlights grew brighter, cutting through the thick darkness of the deserted road. Amber stopped, her heart pounding with both hope and fear. Was this her salvation, or had Hale and Rivers returned to finish what they started? She couldn't afford to take chances, but she also couldn't afford to stay hidden in the shadows, injured and vulnerable. If she didn't act, she and her unborn child wouldn't survive the night. She raised her trembling hand and waved it weakly, her voice hoarse as she called out, "Help! Please, help me!" The car slowed, its engine rumbling softly as it came to a stop a few feet away. Amber squinted against the brightness of the headlights, her eyes adjusting as the driver's side door opened. A young man stepped out, his silhouette framed by the light. His cautious movements betrayed his uncertainty, but as he came closer, his expression shifted from suspicion to shock. "Ma'am, are you okay?" His voice was laced with concern, his eyes darting to her disheveled appearance. Amber could see now that he was young, perhaps in his late 20s, with dark skin and kind, wide-set eyes. His clothes were simple, a gray hoodie and jeans, but his demeanor carried an air of sincerity. "Please," Amber rasped, her voice barely audible. They left me. I need help." The man's brows furrowed as he looked her over, taking in the blood on her wrists, the dirt and grime streaking her face, the desperation in her eyes. "What happened? Who did this to you?" Amber swayed, her knees threatening to give out beneath her. "Police," she whispered, the word barely escaping her lips before the weight of exhaustion overtook her. Her legs buckled, and she began to collapse. The man rushed forward, catching her just in time. "Whoa, I've got you," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. He guided her to the passenger seat of his car, easing her in carefully. As he buckled her seatbelt, he noticed her pregnant belly and froze, his concern deepening. "You're pregnant," he said softly, almost to himself. "Jesus." Amber managed a weak nod. "Please, just get me to a hospital." He nodded quickly, shutting the door and jogging around to the driver's side. As the car pulled onto the road, Amber leaned her head back against the seat, her eyes fluttering shut. The adrenaline that had kept her moving was fading, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. She barely registered the hum of the engine or the man's hurried voice as he spoke into his phone, explaining the situation to an emergency operator. Amber woke to the sterile brightness of hospital lights and the muffled sounds of distant voices. The first thing she felt was the softness of the bed beneath her, a stark contrast to the cold, unforgiving rails she had escaped from. Her body ached all over, but the pain was dulled, likely by medication. She shifted slightly, wincing as the motion sent a sharp pang through her abdomen. "Easy there," a voice said gently. Amber turned her head to see a nurse standing beside her bed, adjusting the IV drip connected to her arm. "You're safe now. You're in the hospital." The words washed over her like a bomb, but the relief was short-lived. Memories of the night came flooding back, the flashing lights, the cruel laughter, the ropes biting into her skin. Her breath quickened, her chest tightening as the weight of it all threatened to crush her. The nurse placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You're okay," she said softly. "The baby's okay too. We ran some tests and everything looks good." Amber's eyes filled with tears and she nodded, unable to speak. The relief of knowing her child was unharmed was overwhelming, but it did little to dull the simmering anger that burned beneath the surface. "Someone's been waiting to see you," the nurse added with a small smile. "He's the one who brought you in. Should I let him in?" Amber hesitated, then nodded. The nurse stepped out, and moments later, the young man from the road entered the room. He looked hesitant, his hands shoved into his pockets, but his eyes were filled with concern. "I'm glad to see you're awake," he said, stopping a few feet from the bed. "I wasn't sure you'd make it." Amber offered him a weak smile. "Thank you. I don't even know your name." "Derek," he said, "Derek Carter. And you're Amber Williams, right?" The way he said her name, with a mix of recognition and awe, told her he knew exactly who she was. She nodded, bracing herself for the questions that were sure to follow. "I've seen you on the news," Derek continued. "You're the one fighting for police reform, the one calling out the corruption." Amber met his gaze, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "And that's exactly why this happened." Derek pulled up a chair and sat down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. What happened out there? Who did this to you? Amber took a deep breath, the words coming slowly as she recounted the events of the night. She told him about the stop, the threats, the cruel way the officers had tied her to the tracks and left her to die. Derek listened intently, his expression darkening with every detail. I don't even have words, he said when she finished. But you can't let them get away with this. We have to do something. We? Amber asked, arching a brow. Derek nodded firmly. Yeah, we. I'm not just going to sit back and let those bastards walk away from this. Whatever you need, I'm in. Amber studied him, searching for any sign of hesitation or doubt, but found none. For the first time since the ordeal began, she felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone in this fight. Thank you, Derek, she said softly. I'll need all the help I can get. He smiled, a hint of determination in his eyes. Then let's get to work. The next few hours passed in a blur of medical tests and quiet conversations. Amber's husband, Jason, arrived shortly after Derek left, his face etched with worry and anger. He held her hand tightly as she recounted the events once more, his jaw clenching with each detail. They're not getting away with this, Jason said, his voice low and firm. We're going to make sure they pay for what they've done. Amber nodded, her resolve hardening. She had survived the night, but her fight was far from over. Hale and Rivers thought they could silence her, but they had underestimated her will to fight. As she lay in the hospital bed that night, her mind raced with plans. She would gather evidence, call on her allies, and use every resource at her disposal to expose the truth. This wasn't just about her. It was about the countless others who had suffered in silence, their voices drowned out by a system that refused to hold itself accountable. Amber closed her eyes, her hand resting protectively on her belly. For her child, for herself, and for everyone who had ever been silenced, she would fight. And she would win. Amber leaned back in the hospital bed, the soft hum of machines and distant footsteps in the hallway filling the room with an almost meditative rhythm. Jason sat beside her, his hand wrapped protectively around hers, his presence a steady anchor in the chaos that had engulfed their lives in the past 24 hours. Her body ached, and her wrists still bore the raw, angry marks from the ropes that had bound her, but her mind was sharper than ever. Survival was only the beginning. Now it was time for justice. The door to the room opened quietly, and Derek stepped in, his expression both hesitant and resolute. He had returned as he promised, ready to help in any way he could. Jason glanced at him, his gaze appraising but not unkind. Amber introduced them briefly, the weight of their shared purpose unspoken but understood. First thing we need to do, Jason began, his voice steady, is document everything. Amber, you'll give a full statement, every detail you can remember. Derek, if you saw anything at the scene when you found her, we'll need that too. Derek nodded, pulling a small notebook from his pocket. I didn't see much when I got there, but I'll write down what I can. Jason's eyes narrowed in focus. We also need to collect physical evidence. The ropes, the tracks, any trace they left behind. We'll go back to the scene. Amber sat up slightly, wincing at the movement. That's dangerous. What if they're watching? They know I survived. Jason's jaw tightened. That's why we won't go alone. I'll call in some favors. There are people in the community, people we trust, who can help us. And I'm reaching out to an investigator I know. He's one of the good ones, someone who's been fighting this fight long before it became a public issue. Amber felt a flicker of hope at his confidence, but it was tempered by the reality of what they were up against. The system wasn't designed to hold men like Hale and Rivers accountable. She had spent her entire career exposing that truth, but this time it was personal. Jason continued, his voice firm. "We'll also need to notify the media. They need to know what happened to you, Amber. The world needs to hear your story." Amber hesitated. The media had always been a double-edged sword. They could amplify her voice, but they could also twist her words, turn her into a symbol rather than a person. And yet, she knew Jason was right. Staying silent would only embolden her attackers. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice steady, "but only when we have enough evidence to make it undeniable. If we go public too soon, they'll try to discredit me." Jason nodded, his expression softening. "We'll do it your way." Later that evening, Amber sat alone with Derek as Jason stepped out to make calls. The room felt quieter without Jason's commanding presence, and Derek shifted in his seat, his nervous energy palpable. "You really don't have to be here," Amber said gently, studying his face. "You've already done so much." Derek shook his head, his gaze steady. "I want to be here. What they did to you, it's not right. And it's not just about you, it's about all of us. My little sister, she's 15, and she's already scared of the police. That's not how it's supposed to be." Amber felt a pang of empathy. She had heard countless stories like Derek's over the years, each one a testament to the deep, systemic rot that infected the justice system. It was why she had fought so hard for so long. But hearing it now, in the wake of her own trauma, gave it a renewed urgency. "We're going to change that," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Not just for your sister, but for everyone." Derek nodded, his determination mirroring her own. "Whatever you need, I'm in." The next morning, Amber was discharged from the hospital. Jason insisted on driving her home, his protectiveness almost suffocating but not unwelcome. Derek followed in his own car, his presence a silent reassurance. The drive was tense, the weight of their mission hanging heavy in the air. When they arrived at their house, Amber was struck by how normal everything looked. The sunlit porch, the neatly trimmed lawn, the comforting familiarity of home. It all felt jarringly out of place after the horrors she had endured. She stepped inside, the warmth of the space wrapping around her like a shield, but it did little to ease the tension in her chest. Jason immediately set up a workspace in the dining room, his laptop and legal pads spread out across the table. Amber joined him, her fingers still trembling as she typed out her statement. She recounted every detail she could remember, her words spilling onto the screen in a torrent of clarity and pain. The flashing lights, the cruel laughter, the cold metal of the rails against her back, it all came rushing back, vivid and unrelenting. Derek sat across from her, writing in his notebook. Occasionally, he would glance up, his eyes filled with quiet admiration for her resilience. Amber pretended not to notice, focusing instead on the task at hand. By the time she finished, her body felt drained, but her mind was sharper than ever. She pushed the laptop toward Jason, who read through her statement with a critical eye. When he looked up, his expression was a mix of pride and sorrow. "This is powerful, Amber," he said, "but it's just the beginning. We need more." Amber nodded. "Then let's get more." That evening, they returned to the scene of the crime. Jason had called in reinforcements, a small group of trusted community activists and an independent investigator named Marcus Green. Marcus was a tall, imposing man with a sharp gaze that missed nothing. He had spent years uncovering police misconduct and was one of the few people Amber trusted implicitly. The group moved cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they combed the area for evidence. Marcus examined the tracks with meticulous care, photographing the ropes that still lay discarded nearby and collecting soil samples where Amber's blood had stained the ground. "This is good," Marcus said, his voice low but steady. "But we'll need more to make this stick. Witnesses, video footage, anything that puts those bastards here." Jason nodded. "We'll find it." As they worked, Amber felt a surge of gratitude for the people around her. They weren't just helping her, they were fighting for something bigger. For justice, for accountability, for a future where no one else would have to endure what she had. But even as hope flickered, a deep unease lingered. Hale and Rivers were still out there, and she knew they wouldn't go down without a fight. Amber sat at the dining room table, her laptop open in front of her, the screen glowing with the details of the statement she had painstakingly written. The sunlight streaming through the windows contrasted sharply with the weight of the task at hand. Around her, Jason and Marcus quietly sifted through evidence they had gathered the previous night. Photographs of the tracks, soil samples, the ropes that had bound her, and GPS coordinates meticulously marked on a map. Derek hovered nearby, organizing files and taking notes. Each person moved with an unspoken urgency, the air in the room charged with determination. Amber leaned back in her chair, pressing her hands against her belly as the baby kicked lightly. It was a small reminder of what she was fighting for, not just justice for herself, but for the life she was about to bring into a world that desperately needed change. Jason looked up from his notes, his brow furrowed in concentration. "We need to move quickly. Every day that passes gives them more time to cover their tracks. Hale and Rivers aren't stupid. They'll have allies protecting them." Amber nodded, her gaze fixed on the laptop. "Then we need to get ahead of them. We can't just rely on evidence. We need to control the narrative." Marcus chimed in, his voice calm but authoritative. "Public pressure will be our strongest weapon. We have the start of a solid case, but it won't hold if we can't force the system to take it seriously. Amber, your story has to go public, but it has to be airtight. No room for doubt or misinterpretation." Amber closed her eyes briefly, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She had been in the spotlight before, but this was different. This wasn't about advocating for change or debating policy. It was about laying bare her trauma in a way that left her vulnerable to scrutiny and attack. But she knew Marcus was right. Without public outrage, the system would bury her case, just as it had buried countless others. Taking a deep breath, she opened her eyes and straightened her shoulders. "Let's do it. But we need to make sure we're ready. Every detail needs to be corroborated, every piece of evidence accounted for." Jason reached for her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "We'll make sure of it. You're not alone in this." The next few days passed in a flurry of preparation. Marcus reached out to his contacts, pulling favors to secure additional resources. He enlisted a forensic specialist to analyze the ropes and soil samples, hoping to tie them definitively to the scene and to Hale and Rivers. Derek, armed with a determination that belied his inexperience, tracked down nearby businesses and homes that might have security cameras overlooking the route Hale and Rivers had taken. Jason coordinated with local activists, rallying support from the community and organizing a network of people willing to amplify Amber's story when the time came. Amber, meanwhile, focused on refining her statement and preparing for the inevitable media onslaught. She rehearsed answers to questions she knew reporters would ask, balancing the raw emotion of her experience with the composure needed to convey credibility. Late at night, when the house was quiet and the others had gone home or fallen asleep, she replayed the events in her mind, determined to remember every detail. It was exhausting, but she refused to let herself falter. Too much was at stake. One evening, as the group gathered in the living room to review their progress, Derek returned with a triumphant smile. "I found something," he announced, holding up a USB drive. Jason leaned forward. "What is it?" "There's a gas station about 2 miles from the tracks," Derek explained, plugging the drive into Amber's laptop. "Their cameras caught footage of Hale and Rivers driving by in their cruiser around the time Amber says they took her." The screen lit up with grainy black and white footage. It showed a police cruiser speeding down the road, its license plate clearly visible. Amber felt a surge of vindication as she watched. It wasn't definitive proof of what they had done, but it placed them in the vicinity at the right time, a crucial piece of the puzzle. "This is good," Marcus said, nodding in approval. "We'll add it to the file. It's not enough on its own, but it strengthens our case." Amber felt a flicker of hope. For the first time, it felt like they were gaining ground. But she knew better than to let herself get complacent. Hale and Rivers wouldn't go down without a fight, and the system would do everything in its power to protect them. The next morning, Amber and Jason met with a journalist from a reputable national outlet. The journalist, a sharp-eyed woman named Laura Cheng, had a reputation for fearless reporting on issues of systemic injustice. She listened intently as Amber recounted her story, her pen moving swiftly across her notebook. "This is horrifying," Laura said when Amber finished. "And unfortunately, it's all too familiar. Cases like this happen more often than most people realize, but they rarely get the attention they deserve. Your story has the potential to change that." Amber met her gaze, her voice steady despite the tension in her chest. "That's what I want. I'm not just fighting for myself. I'm fighting for everyone who's been silenced or ignored." Laura nodded, her expression resolute. "I'll make sure your story is told, but you need to be ready. Once this goes public, the backlash will be fierce. The police will try to discredit you, and their supporters won't hold back." "I'm ready," Amber said, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. "I don't have a choice." 2 days later, the story broke. Laura's article detailed every aspect of Amber's ordeal, from the initial traffic stop to her harrowing escape. It included photographs of the ropes and tracks, statements from Jason, Marcus, and Derek, and the gas station footage placing Hale and Rivers near the scene. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media erupted with outrage, hashtags demanding justice for Amber trending within hours. News outlets picked up the story, and Amber found herself at the center of a media storm. Messages of support poured in from across the country, but so did the attacks. Anonymous accounts accused her of lying, of fabricating the story for attention or financial gain. Some called her a hero. Others called her a fraud. Amber refused to let the negativity deter her. Every hateful comment, every baseless accusation only strengthened her resolve. She knew the truth, and she was determined to see it acknowledged. As the pressure mounted, the police department announced an internal investigation into Hale and Rivers. It was a small victory, but Amber knew it wasn't enough. An internal investigation could easily be a cover-up. She needed a full-scale, independent inquiry, and she wouldn't rest until she got it. One evening, as Amber sat in the living room with Jason, Derek, and Marcus, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from an anonymous sender, the subject line reading, "You're not safe." Amber's blood ran cold as she opened the message. It contained a single sentence. "Drop this, or you'll regret it." Jason looked over her shoulder, his expression darkening as he read the message. "They're trying to intimidate you." Amber set the phone down, her hands shaking. "It won't work." But as she said the words, a knot of fear tightened in her chest. She wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. She was fighting for her life. The court building loomed ahead, an imposing structure of gray stone and glass that seemed to absorb the morning light rather than reflect it. Amber stood at the base of the steps, her heart pounding as she stared at the heavy doors that would lead her into the next phase of her fight. Behind her, Jason placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. Derek stood nearby, holding a bundle of documents, his expression a mixture of determination and apprehension. Marcus and a small group of community allies flanked them, their presence a reminder that Amber wasn't alone. A crowd had gathered at the foot of the courthouse steps, a mix of supporters, reporters, and protesters. Signs bobbed in the air, their messages stark and unyielding. Justice for Amber, end police corruption, and no justice, no peace. The chants of the crowd blended into a cacophony of voices, their energy vibrating in the air around her. Amber took a deep breath, her gaze scanning the faces in the crowd. She caught sight of a young black girl holding her mother's hand, her wide eyes filled with admiration and hope. The sight grounded Amber, reminding her of why she had come this far. This fight wasn't just about her, it was about the countless others who had been silenced, ignored, or erased by the system. "Are you ready?" Jason asked quietly. Amber nodded, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging within her. "I'm ready." They ascended the steps together, their footsteps purposeful, and entered the courthouse. The atmosphere inside was markedly different. Cold, sterile, and heavy with tension. Amber's legal team greeted them in the lobby, their faces serious but resolute. Among them was a young attorney named Rachel Evans, whose sharp intellect and unflinching determination had been instrumental in building their case. "We've got a solid argument," Rachel said as they walked toward the courtroom. "The evidence is strong and the public support adds weight. But we need to be prepared for their defense. They'll attack your credibility, try to discredit everything you say." Amber nodded. "Let them try." The courtroom itself was a theater of opposing forces. The defense team, representing Hale and Rivers, sat with their clients at one table, their polished appearances doing little to mask the smugness etched into their expressions. Hale, in particular, wore a faint smirk, his confidence unshaken. Rivers sat stiffly beside him, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Amber took her seat at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Jason sat beside her, his presence a constant source of strength, while Rachel and Marcus arranged their files and notes. Across the aisle, Hale leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on Amber with a mixture of contempt and amusement. The sight of him made her stomach churn, but she refused to look away. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The trial began with the usual formalities, the lawyers on both sides presenting their opening statements. Rachel spoke first, her voice clear and commanding as she outlined the case against Hale and Rivers. She described Amber's ordeal in vivid detail, painting a picture of abuse of power, systemic corruption, and deliberate cruelty. "For too long," Rachel concluded, "officers like Hale and Rivers have operated with impunity, believing themselves above the law. Today, we begin the process of holding them accountable, not just for what they did to Amber Williams, but for the countless others who have suffered in silence." The defense's opening statement was predictably dismissive, their attorney framing Hale and Rivers as dedicated officers merely doing their duty. They painted Amber as an opportunist, someone using her public profile to fabricate a story for attention and personal gain. The words stung, but Amber held her ground, refusing to let their attacks rattle her. The first day of testimony was grueling. Amber took the stand, recounting her experience with unflinching honesty. She described every moment of the night she had been stopped, the degrading words and actions of Hale and Rivers, the terror of being tied to the train tracks, and the desperation that had fueled her escape. Her voice wavered at times, but her resolve never faltered. As she spoke, she noticed the jurors watching her intently, their expressions ranging from sympathy to disbelief. She couldn't tell whether they believed her, but she knew she had to trust in the truth of her story. The defense's cross-examination was brutal. They questioned her memory, her motives, even her character, implying that she had exaggerated or fabricated parts of her account. Amber met their accusations head-on, her responses measured and unwavering. "Miss Williams," the defense attorney said, his tone dripping with condescension, "you claim you were left tied to train tracks, yet here you are, alive and well. Doesn't that seem a bit convenient?" Amber's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "What's convenient," she said, her gaze fixed on the attorney, "is how officers like Hale and Rivers count on people like me not surviving to tell their story." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The defense attorney moved on, but Amber knew she had struck a nerve. The following days brought a parade of witnesses and evidence. Marcus presented the physical evidence they had gathered: the ropes, the soil samples, the gas station footage placing Hale and Rivers near the scene. A forensic expert testified to the authenticity of the evidence, linking it conclusively to Amber's account. The defense attempted to discredit every piece of evidence, but cracks began to show in their arguments. They couldn't explain the GPS data from Hale and Rivers' cruiser, which placed them at the location of the abandoned tracks. They couldn't refute the forensic analysis of the ropes, which bore traces of Amber's blood. And they couldn't silence the voices of community members who came forward to testify about Hale and Rivers' history of misconduct. One witness, a young man named Elijah, recounted his own encounter with the officers. His voice trembled as he described being harassed and beaten by Hale and Rivers during a routine traffic stop. His testimony was a stark reminder that Amber's case was part of a much larger pattern. As the trial neared its conclusion, the courtroom became a battleground of emotions. The defense doubled down on their attacks, while Rachel and her team pushed back with unwavering determination. Amber sat through it all, her nerves frayed but her resolve unbroken. On the final day, the closing arguments were delivered. Rachel's words were powerful and unyielding, a call to action for the jury to hold Hale and Rivers accountable. "This case is about more than two corrupt officers," she said. "It's about a system that allows people like them to thrive. It's about a culture of impunity that endangers every person in this room. Today, you have the power to say, 'Enough,' to demand better, to deliver justice." The defense's closing argument was a desperate attempt to sow doubt, but the cracks in their narrative were too wide to ignore. When the jury retired to deliberate, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Amber waited with Jason, Derek, Marcus, and Rachel in a small conference room, the hours stretching into what felt like an eternity. They spoke little, each lost in their own thoughts. Amber clung to Jason's hand, her mind racing with every possible outcome. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom fell silent. Amber's heart pounded as the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict. On the charge of assault, we find the defendants guilty. The words hit her like a wave, a flood of relief and vindication washing over her. As the foreperson continued to read the verdicts, guilty on multiple counts of misconduct, abuse of power, and endangerment. Amber felt a weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't just a victory for her, it was a victory for everyone who had ever been silenced. As the judge pronounced the sentence, Hale and Rivers' smug expressions crumbled. For the first time, they looked truly afraid. Amber met Hale's gaze across the courtroom, her own expression calm and resolute. He had tried to break her, but she had emerged stronger. When the proceedings ended, Amber stepped outside to face the crowd gathered on the courthouse steps. The cheers of her supporters filled the air, their chants of justice for Amber ringing out like a battle cry. She stood tall, her hand resting on her belly, a symbol of resilience and hope. This fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Amber felt a glimmer of hope for the future. Together, they had taken a step toward dismantling the system that had allowed men like Hale and Rivers to operate unchecked. And she knew they wouldn't stop until justice was more than just a word. It was a reality. The courthouse steps felt different now, quieter, as Amber stood there, the echoes of the crowd's cheers fading into memory. The verdict had been delivered, and the system, so often a source of frustration and despair, had, for once, worked in her favor. Hale and Rivers were guilty, and they would face the consequences of their actions. Yet, even as the weight of this victory settled on her shoulders, Amber knew it was only the beginning of a much longer fight. Jason's hand found hers, a steadying presence in the midst of her swirling thoughts. He gave her a soft smile, one filled with pride and relief. "You did it," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "No," Amber replied, shaking her head slightly. "We did it." Her gaze shifted to the group around her. Jason, Marcus, Derek, Rachel, and the countless allies who had stood by her side. Each of them had played a role, their unwavering support a shield against the storm. Amber drew strength from them, but she also felt the heavy burden of responsibility. The spotlight was on her now, and she couldn't waste the opportunity to demand more. Derek approached, holding his phone up to show her a live video stream. It was footage of the crowd outside the courthouse, their chants continuing even after the verdict had been announced. People held signs with messages like "Justice for all and end systemic racism," their voices united in a call for change. "You've started something bigger than this case," Derek said, his tone reverent. "They're looking to you now." Amber exhaled slowly, the enormity of what he was saying sinking in. She had always known this fight was about more than her own survival, but seeing the ripple effect in real time made it all the more real. The drive home was subdued, the adrenaline of the trial giving way to exhaustion. Amber leaned against the window, watching the cityscape blur into the suburbs. Jason kept glancing at her, his worry evident even in his silence. She knew he was thinking about the threats they'd received, the vitriol that had come pouring in from those who didn't want to see justice served. "Do you think it's over?" she asked quietly, breaking the silence. Jason didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured. "The case is over, but the fight isn't. You've challenged a system that doesn't like being challenged. They won't let this go easily." Amber nodded, her jaw tightening. "Then neither will I." When they arrived home, the first thing Amber noticed was the quiet. The house, so often filled with the sounds of late-night strategy sessions and phone calls, felt almost unnaturally still. But as she stepped inside, the familiarity of the space brought a sense of calm. This was her sanctuary, the place where she had fought to rebuild herself after the attack. It felt fitting that it was also where she would plan her next steps. Amber sat down at the dining room table, the same spot where they had pieced together the case against Hale and Rivers. Jason joined her, his expression softening as he reached for her hand. "You've done enough," he said gently. "You've earned the right to rest." Amber shook her head. "We both know this isn't about me anymore. If I stop now, it'll send the wrong message. People need to see that this fight doesn't end with a single verdict." Jason sighed but didn't argue. He knew her too well to try. Over the next few weeks, Amber threw herself into the work of turning her personal victory into systemic change. She worked closely with Marcus and Rachel to draft proposals for police reform, drawing on her own experiences as well as the stories of others who had come forward during the trial. The proposals called for increased accountability measures, independent oversight committees, and mandatory bias training for law enforcement officers. Amber also began speaking at rallies and community events, her presence galvanizing those who had long felt powerless in the face of injustice. She shared her story not as a victim, but as a survivor, a testament to the strength of those who refused to be silenced. One of the most emotional moments came when she visited a local high school to speak with students about her journey. Standing in the auditorium, surrounded by young faces filled with curiosity and hope, Amber felt a renewed sense of purpose. She answered their questions honestly, her words resonating in a way that no policy proposal ever could. "What's the hardest part of fighting for change?" one student asked, her voice tentative. Amber thought for a moment before answering. "The hardest part is knowing that change doesn't happen overnight. It's a long, painful process, and sometimes it feels like you're not making any progress. But you have to keep going, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." The student nodded, her eyes shining with determination. Amber felt a flicker of hope. These kids were the future, and if even one of them was inspired to take up the fight, it would all be worth it. As Amber's profile grew, so did the backlash. Online threats became more frequent, and one night, a brick was thrown through the window of their home. Jason insisted on hiring private security, and though Amber initially resisted, she eventually agreed. She knew she couldn't afford to take risks, not with her baby's due date drawing closer. Despite the challenges, Amber pressed on. She gave interviews, met with lawmakers, and continued to amplify the voices of those who had been silenced for too long. Her resilience inspired others to join the fight, and soon her efforts began to yield tangible results. A coalition of activists and community leaders formed around her, their collective voice too loud to ignore. One day, as Amber was preparing for a meeting with a local senator, she felt the first pang of labor. It was subtle at first, a dull ache that quickly grew sharper. Jason rushed her to the hospital, his panic barely contained as he held her hand through the contractions. Hours later, Amber held her newborn son in her arms, tears streaming down her face as she whispered a silent promise to him. She would fight for a better world, not just for him, but for every child who deserved to grow up without fear. The weeks that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings, but Amber found a strange kind of peace in the chaos of new motherhood. Her son, whom she named Elijah after the young man who had testified during her trial, became a symbol of everything she was fighting for. One evening, as Amber rocked Elijah to sleep, Jason approached with a laptop. "You should see this," he said, his voice tinged with pride. Amber looked at the screen, her breath catching as she read the headline, "Amber Williams named leader of National Police Reform Initiative." The article detailed her growing influence, highlighting the progress her coalition had made in pushing for legislative change. "You're making a difference," Jason said, his voice soft. "People are listening." Amber smiled, her gaze shifting to Elijah's peaceful face. "This is just the beginning," she said quietly. "There's still so much work to do." Jason nodded, his hand resting on her shoulder. "We'll do it together." Amber leaned into his touch, her heart full. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready. She had survived the darkest night of her life, and now she was determined to build a brighter future, not just for herself, but for everyone who believed in the possibility of justice. As she looked out the window, the city lights twinkling in the distance, Amber felt a quiet sense of hope. Change was coming, and she would be there to see it through. For Elijah, for Jason, for everyone. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more impactful stories. Check out our other videos to explore more journeys that inspire and challenge. Share this video with your friends and family. Together, we can keep these conversations going. See you in the next story.